Thank you very much. I know as far as lunchtime entertainment options go, 70 degrees and sunny is about as formidable of an opponent as you can get. So I appreciate everyone giving me your vote of confidence. I hope it's not wasted. And I'm going to try to go through things fairly quickly here. Okay. I'm going to try to go through things fairly quickly here to give us plenty of time for a conversation at the end. Most of what I'm going to be talking about today is premised on fairly simple observation. And that is that people who spend most of their time building computer simulations, like especially simulations of long-term environmental changes, they really experience time a little bit differently than the rest of us. This is especially true for people who work in rural areas, like the places I'm going to be talking about in a moment. People who build models that are designed to predict, say, how fast trees grow in a given patch of forest, and how quickly species compositions change over time, right? So if most of us go into a forest, we're probably going to experience our surroundings without thinking too much about how it looked before we got there, or how it might look years or decades into the future. We might not think about, say, clusters of tiny saplings becoming huge spruce trees, or new species like birch and aspen rushing in to fill an old pine stand after a big fire. Right? If we've taken a few ecology classes, I imagine applies to some of the people in this room, I mean, we might think about what kinds of plants and animals can live in a simplified, replanted forest. We might think about the economic dimensions of forestry research through this lens. But even so, we probably won't think about how quickly these trees can produce wood, or how much wood might be needed to keep say, a lumber mill in business, right? So it's not just that forestry modelers can see a lot of these changes before they happen. It's also that they feel obligated to help plan for them, right? And this means generating and updating computer models that are clear enough that conservationists, logging companies, and other groups can use them to make clear decisions about how to plan for resource uses in the future, right? So in other words, it's not just the future forests that scientists see out there and in these models, but it's some future version of themselves as scientists and as environmental stewards too. And it's this dual role that I want us to think about as I get into this talk today. So of course, this is not just about passively seeing changes in the forest and in the models. If you ask somebody in a forestry program about the relationship that they have between models and actual forests, you're probably going to get some variation on this quote. Models don't just describe changes, they produce them. This is what anthropologists might call performativity, right? You describe change and thereby enact it, right? And in computer models, you see this over and over. Hopefully thinking about this, though, it immediately triggers a question, right? So what causes a researcher to project one kind of forest versus another? I mean, does it matter whether it's a government scientist who's producing these models, or say a logging company employee, a university researcher, an independent contractor? I mean, maybe the biggest question of all for my own research as an anthropologist of science and technology is, how stable are the boundaries between these different professions in 2016 anyway? I think these are the kinds of questions that, especially if you're an undergrad who's training in environmental resource management related disciplines, the difference between these kinds of professions is probably something that you think about quite a bit, right? So again, how do these imaginary researchers, what do they see themselves becoming in the future? And how does it shape the way they work in the present? This is essentially what I want to talk about today. Okay, so I'm going to start, rather than jumping right into my own research, I'm going to try to give you a broad overview of how historians and social scientists have looked at scientific tools like computer simulations to explore a wide range of connections about how science and society co-shape one another. It's really going to be a kind of mini sales pitch for science and technology studies, which is starting to really get a critical mass here at Tufts. And we can talk more about that in the Q&A. So this includes research areas well outside of forestry, right? So I just want to give you a sense of how far-reaching some of these questions are. And I also want to contextualize where all this research comes from. And we can't pretend like something like a computer model comes from nowhere. We always have to pay very close attention to what's going on around the people who are doing this work when they're doing this work, right? Got to contextualize. So that means seeing why British Columbia and Canada more generally matters to this story. And that ultimately is going to allow me to focus on a dispute between two highly esteemed British Columbia-based forestry modelers who approach their work in very different ways, right? Who are both nearing retirement and who are both actively thinking about what's going to happen to their models, to their legacies, and to the forests of British Columbia after they're gone. Okay, so we're going to start this process of contextualization by going through a quick review of some of the main aspects of, some of the main impacts of forestry science in the 20th century in British Columbia. And we're going to try to convey kind of what it meant for such a massive region, for people who live there to start thinking about their forests, not necessarily just as this kind of landscape that's growing and changing over time, but as a predictable crop, right? So we're going to kind of define what we mean by silviculture, like agriculture for trees. And we're going to follow this with a look at how scientists and other activists have responded to one particular forest management system that happens to be pretty ubiquitous, essentially clear-cutting and replanting large areas with one or two simple species of trees. How people have responded to these issues by setting up experiments and designing simulators to test out alternative methods. And finally, we're going to drill into the actual case study here and say a little bit more about my research by focusing on how changes in government and in computer technology have changed the way that forestry scientists approach their work. I'm going to try to convey how the image of the future forest that's projected by a modeling expert depends on where and how she works, and on the kinds of pressures and just real-world expectations that they're facing in their day-to-day jobs. Like, this is fairly mundane stuff that can add up to have massive consequences. And so that's really the main point here, is that, as I showed in that earlier quote, simulations really do remake the world. But this relationship works in reverse. And tracing out the feedback loop that this involves means paying really close attention on a very personal level to what kind of world a given scientist wants to be living in, and what kind of power that they have to enact this. Okay, before jumping into this, though, I mean, some basic questions. Why would somebody want to make a computer simulation in the first place? I mean, why not just set up a long-term experiment and measure everything out? I mean, there are lots and lots of reasons for this, some of which are more obvious than others. And a number of historians, anthropologists, and philosophers of science have explored some of these questions in considerable detail lately. And I'd be happy to talk about some of this work in the Q&A afterwards. But some of these answers should be, I think, fairly straightforward. There are a lot of processes that are simply too big to capture even within a huge collaboration of researchers, right? Or they're too slow to follow within the lifespan of a single scientist. I mean, a large pine tree might live 400 years. I don't know too many 400-year-old forestry scientists, although some of those guys up north come pretty close. So it's simply an issue of practical logistics that nevertheless have significant consequences on the kinds of questions that people can ask, right? In other fields, simulating data can be a lot cheaper than going out and collecting it, right? This is something that's going to be relevant for what I'm describing as well. So this is very true in forestry, where, for instance, trees are quite numerous, especially in British Columbia, and the number of government employees that are available to actually go out and measure these things has shrunk and shrunk and shrunk over the last couple decades, right? And the anxieties that this loss of fieldwork programs have caused, not just for the people who are doing the fieldwork, but for the people who are relying on this data. This is something that I want us to think about as well. So that's a little bit about the kind of practical dimensions of why to choose a simulation over or a kind of more conventional experiment. I want us to think a little bit about the social aspects of this as well. And this transition to simulation in different fields, this has had some pretty dramatic effects that I think a lot of people can empathize with, even if they don't necessarily think about it in their day-to-day lives. So if you hang out with enough old environmental scientists, doesn't kind of matter where they fall on the political spectrum, you've probably heard some variation on this quote, which comes from Sherry Turkle, who's a science and technology studies scholar at MIT. And she says that across disciplines, there is anxiety about the retirement of senior colleagues. They're seen as special because they were in touch with a way of doing science and design that was less mediated, more direct. You can take issue with her uses of the word mediated and direct, you're a social scientist, but the observation is pretty accurate, right? I mean, any discipline that used to be predominantly field-based and that has increased its reliance on computer simulations, like, say, petroleum geology, right? We'll have an old guard who feels threatened by this change and who like to criticize their younger colleagues for not having a feel for the discipline or not being tough enough or whatever. This is something that you hear from, say, geologists all the time. There are lots of reasons for this. As an anthropologist, I'm allowed to point out that this is not unrelated to the fact that this old guard is predominantly composed of white men. And environmental science disciplines that used to have a large fieldwork component to them are increasingly seeing larger numbers of women and people of color entering their fields. So a lot of these complaints mirror the sorts of kind of old white man griping that one might hear applied to society as a whole, loss of toughness. These kinds of sound bites that were becoming increasingly ubiquitous in mainstream media these days, right? But more generally, without kind of going too far down that road, I think it's pretty fair to say that field-based researchers who feel like their expertise is being replaced with computer simulations, who feel like they themselves are being replaced by computers, they really just feel anxious about becoming obsolete. And I mean, it's not about not understanding the new kinds of hierarchies that allow somebody to become prestigious and influential in a computer-based research environment, right? And if you think about it this way, the kind of bitterness that's implied in this quote, it begins to make a little bit more sense, right? I mean, you spend decades trying to build a career within a particular professional system, and then you get old, and the standard for what counts as worthwhile research suddenly changes. The hierarchy suddenly changes. Like, how would you feel, right? But still, these attitudes are held even in fields that were forced to switch to computer-based virtual research methods like nuclear weapons testing, right? So the US stopped testing nuclear weapons, stopped testing physical nuclear weapons in the early 1990s, part of the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty that went into effect under the Clinton administration. But on a social level, a whole generation of senior researchers who had established themselves by leading test teams and had to compete for prestige with these guys who were involved in kind of coordinating hundreds of different people out in the underground in the deserts of Nevada for these massive physical tests. Suddenly they had to compete for prestige with young programmers who had previously held pretty minor roles in these labs, right? So it's pretty disorienting, pretty alienating for people who are used to thinking about hierarchy, prestige, and legacy in particular ways, right? But even here, you see people critiquing simulation builders for not being tough enough, right? So the point that I'm trying to make with these comparisons is just to kind of show that it's basically impossible to separate technical arguments about the usefulness of simulations, of which there are many, right, from the anxieties that are stirred up by scientists seeing their identities challenged by changes in practice, right? This is how this is ultimately an anthropological problem, right? So this is true for models that are used to understand global climate change as well, right? Which have made a lot of these conversations even more tense, partly just because the collaborations involved in the production of these models are so large, right? I mean, things like the general circulation model, nice pretty image of which you see here. These have to be developed by coordinated teams responsible for different components. Say, like one team in Canada might be responsible for developing a model of ocean circulation. Another might be in Germany might be responsible for developing a model of atmospheric circulation. Another team in Chile might be responsible for a model that stitches together the two, right? So when you have this many people working together, you essentially have, you have to trust the results of the people that you're collaborating with without fully understanding what they're working on, right? All kinds of anthropological dimensions to look at here. And especially because of what they're working on. This automatically puts people into political debates, whether they're government scientists or not. And these are things that have been explored by, anthropologists and historians of science in increasing detail in recent years. And I'm happy to, again, talk more about that afterwards if you're interested as well. And one of the things that's interesting as far as how these hierarchies work and how scientific institutions communicate to broader publics is, I think it's pretty easy to say that it's more dangerous for these scientists to admit doubt, even though the sources of doubt when you're trying to assemble something like this model are immense, right? And it's difficult for them to talk openly about the diversity of historical data sources that they have to rely on for their work, right? So compared to general circulation models and climate change denial, forestry models probably feel pretty safe and tame. I mean, they're certainly less visible than these things that are periodically showing up on the front pages of the news. This is partly because there's so many of them, right? I mean, lots of these are developed by individual research groups to answer one very specific question. They don't all have kind of goofy graphical interfaces like this. All the models that I worked with don't have graphical interfaces, and I didn't feel like showing you pictures of lines of code. So these are other people's forestry models. But say this one, for instance, it might be, this is developed by a group that's interested in figuring out how many of tree species X is going to be knocked down by a windstorm of maximum speed Y, right? These kind of arcane questions that are nevertheless pretty significant in terms of helping people to plan forestry management operations, right? And it's also important to consider the fact that all of these models are going to be developed by different kinds of groups. You're going to have academic groups that are developing models, corporate groups that are developing models, say, for private tree plantations, government groups that are trying to answer a whole different set of questions, right? And each one of these has a different system for establishing prestige and recognizing worthwhile work. The premise of most forestry models, just to make sure that we're on the same page, revolves around the idea that how quickly a tree grows depends on its environment, how much sunlight it gets, what kind of tree it is, how much precipitation it gets, what kinds of trees it's around, like fairly basic stuff, right? Seems simple enough, right? But if we know how fast a particular tree can grow in a given area, then one should be able to optimize it to grow forests as quickly and densely as possible, right? Well, that's kind of exciting. It immediately turns a scientific question into a kind of engineering question, right? But then these modelers immediately have to answer a number of different kinds of questions. What kinds of trees should be grown? Like, how should they be cut down? What kinds of patterns? What kinds of scales? What kinds of forests should planners be trying to create for different animals, for people who want to hike or hunt or gather mushrooms? And scarier questions as well. I mean, what kinds of ecological risks would an optimized forest, however you want to define that, what kinds of risk would they pose if something like a huge fire or a windstorm or a pest outbreak came along, right? And again, how many of these questions are things that can actually be modeled? And how many of these answers are already determined in advance by the research and government policies that feed into these models before a researcher even begins to program a new simulation, right? These are the kinds of social and political entanglements that I want us to think about when we're thinking about something as seemingly mundane as a forest growth model, right? Because all of these things determine how it plays out. In British Columbia, lots of the original answers to these kinds of questions were determined by policies that were developed in the 1940s to support a system called sustained yield management. That is almost impossible to see, I apologize. Which is essentially a system of forest growth and harvesting that's designed to allow for the harvest of huge numbers of trees at predictable rates long into the future. And I'm talking about centuries, right? So this is the kind of model that will provide the assurance that investors need to build sawmills, right? I mean, this one that you can't see, which is very close to where I did my fieldwork, is tiny. But just to give you an idea of the scale of the operations in northwest British Columbia where I work, this is about a 4-hour drive on either side from 5 of the 10 largest timber mills in the world, right? So we're talking about a lot of trees. When I first began visiting British Columbia in 2011, the future that was sketched out by all of these ambitious models, though, it suddenly seemed a lot less predictable. And this is largely because, to simplify a very complicated story, of the faith that a lot of earlier planners had put in these first-generation optimization models. So large area clear-cutting and simplistic replanting schemes, all at the same time, everybody putting in pine because that's the tree that makes the most money, had essentially generated the world's largest and most perfect food source for a tree-killing bug called the mountain pine beetle. You probably haven't heard of it down here because it's in Canada, and we don't know anything about Canada. But it essentially created the largest forest blight in the recorded history of the world. And this happened about 10, 15 years ago. So these are beetles that, this is not an invasive species, right? This is something that normally kills a few mature pine and gets killed off each winter when it gets real cold, right? Down below 30 or 40 degrees below zero, which is pretty normal for that far north in British Columbia. But with warmer winters and these simplified, even-aged, pine-dominant forests, the population of these beetles exploded in the late 1990s and early 2000s, a bit before I began planning my research. So suddenly, forestry models have become a lot more visible, right? And suddenly you're going to start seeing models like this on the front page of the Vancouver Sun and the Toronto Globe and Mail, right? And suddenly these models have also become a lot more politically contentious, right? Of course, just because management decisions based on overly simplistic models got the government of British Columbia into this mess doesn't mean that their dependency on models suddenly goes away, right? No, 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 no. So here's where the timeliness of computer modeling comes in. So remember, I started out by asking, why do a computer model when you could just do an experiment, right? As soon as government forestry scientists in British Columbia and around the rest of Canada began realizing that this beetle epidemic was going to be pretty big, they had to make a huge number of decisions about how to potentially control it, what to do with the dead wood, these sorts of things. And all of these decisions were predicated on knowing how far and how fast the beetle was going to spread. So programmers working for the BC government developed a massive simulator, correlated information about beetle population and movements with models of their effects on trees. And they used it to paint a picture that showed basically the whole province being decimated. Now, just in case this isn't clear, these scary colors down here depict the percent of overall pine killed, right? So some of these forests are going to be 100% pine or close to it, but a lot of them only have a few pine trees. So this is not a map of all forests. And that particular subtlety was something that was lost on a lot of the non-specialists that were viewing these models in the early days. For those of you who aren't used to looking at maps of British Columbia, this is kind of like a plain view. The US border's down here. This is Vancouver Island, Haida Gwaii, Alaska. We're looking at an area that's probably about the size of Sweden, so this is a large area. And the model started to look like this. Should I have done that more slowly so that people online can see? Okay. Okay, so this is exciting and horrifying and one of the sort of eye candy things that draws a lot of people into computer modeling in the first place, right? It literally looks like fire spreading across a floor. But other than offering this kind of terrifying visual, I mean, what does the simulation actually tell us? This is the question I want us to think about, right? Because before researchers had time to prove that most of this wood wasn't actually going to rot or fall down for decades, the model was used to justify massively expanded clear cuts, essentially a return to 1940s policies, as opposed to the 1990s policies that had tried to kind of ameliorate some of the worst effects of clear cutting. And it had been used to justify these policies, whether to clear cut or whether to salvage beetle-killed wood or to just go in and take the trees out before the beetles even got there, right? So a wide range of fairly draconian government measures, right? But this model also eventually helped some modelers to realize that there wouldn't actually be that much wood to cut down for the next 40 years. So the main benefit of all of this modeling, producing a predictable crop that people can make economic planning decisions on, was suddenly falling apart, right? Because this dip about 20, 30, 40 years out corresponds to 80% of the population of rural British Columbia not having any jobs, right? So suddenly these models were producing some pretty scary outlooks. Again, because so many trees had been removed all at once, in direct contradistinction to the kinds of internal propaganda campaigns that British Columbia had been selling itself since the 1940s, right? With fun little ads that looked like this. Okay, so the scope of this model. The scope of this is pretty incredible, right? But the scale itself is part of the problem that I want us to think about here. Because it doesn't really reveal much at all about who is actually producing these simulations. In a sense, because the model seems to kind of speak for itself. So one thing that I always tell my students in any of my anthropology classes is that when someone tells you that an image or a computer model or a graph speaks for itself, get real suspicious, okay? And so huge audiences who are seeing forestry-related models for the first time were being told, look at this, this is terrifying, this model speaks for itself, let's cut all the trees down, right? With bad consequences resulting. Okay, all of these questions, all of the planning questions that I'm talking about too, again, scale is part of the problem because these are being framed by big, centrally connected government research groups who, in some cases, had helped to develop some of these overly simplistic models in the first place, right? So as I'll show as we get further into this, plenty of people saw these problems coming long before they arrived. And they had made arguments in long-term research programs and in other kinds of simulators that were dedicated to illustrating the subtler effects of ecological, the subtler ecological effects of different kinds of logging since the 1990s, right? So many of these kinds of modelers, though, are not based in big government offices in Victoria, British Columbia, or in Toronto, but at small offices way, way up in the woods in northern, rural British Columbia. So this is where this turns into a really anthropological story, right? Because it's not like one of these groups of modelers is bad and the other one's good, or one's right and the other one's wrong. Like, I hope that's not the kind of message that people are going to come away from this with, right? But it's that they're trying to answer similar questions. Where are we going to do with this wood? How are we going to maintain the long-term health of this forest? While having very different ideas about what it means to be a successful scientist and a good community member, right? So the major point here is that it's not just a matter of following individual models, which apparently speak for themselves, but seeing how models are linked to specific communities and to different kinds of research sites and different kinds of research tools. I'm going to try to flesh this out a little bit more as we get into the second half of the talk here. It also means following actual people, which in my case meant spending a lot of time with a forest ecologist and programmer I'm going to call Dennis. I met Dennis in a town called Smithers, about 500 miles north of Vancouver, through a small independent research organization called the Bulkley Valley Research Center. Dennis is a government scientist, but he had gotten his start in Smithers during the early 1990s by setting up a research forest to study how mixed forests respond to partial cutting as an alternative to sustained yield forestry. So this means going out, taking a few trees at a time instead of, clear cutting a square kilometer or however big of an area that's going to be cut down, right? Again, it's always important to think about the larger historical events that are driving scientists to pursue particular questions at particular times. They don't just randomly come to these questions because they're curious, right? In British Columbia in the early 1990s, one of the big drivers was this huge backlash against clear cutting, against images that look like this, right? It was this huge backlash against clear cutting, which brought in a new provincial government, which then funded a wide range of new research programs. And these programs helped to draw ecologists like Dennis away from universities, since the government was finally talking about things like watershed restoration and ecological resilience at large scales, right? These programs also meant more support for regional field offices. And this is a big deal because it meant that government scientists didn't all have to live in the provincial capital. In a place like British Columbia, which is 2,000 kilometers from top to bottom, this is pretty significant. People can actually live where they want to live and pursue scientific careers in rural places. Like, the kinds of questions that they're going to ask are going to be a bit different, right? So numerous research forests began to get set up throughout BC during this period. And they were basically run by whoever was around to help, right? So not always government scientists. And if any of you have grown up in a small town, you know that lots of people have a lot of odd jobs. So something that might get handled as a sort of centrally directed research project in one place plays out very differently with maybe a lot of more heterogeneous help in other areas, right? And a lot of these places started setting up boardwalks, setting up signs like this one, running tours, and some even served as sites for projects run by local students, right? So ultimately, even if it is a government research facility, it has a very different role as far as the kinds of community practices that are coordinated through it. So for Dennis, having his own forest to experiment with meant looking into questions that mainstream forestry research had originally rejected, right? Like the idea that predicting tree growth is kind of impossible to see. This is him kind of futzing around in a little gap in a pretty messy section of forest. It meant looking into these ideas, like the idea that predicting tree growth could be done not based on huge plantations where you cut everything down and start from zero, but on small gaps, like the kinds that would be created by a storm or by trees just naturally dying and falling down. This is something that people had done in tropical ecology programs for some years, but had never been applied to northern temperate forests and had certainly never been applied in any kind of commercial sense as a way of predicting tree growth for commercial purposes, right? So thinking about cutting trees as just one of another kind of natural disturbance, pretty significant kind of epistemological shift in terms of going from a crop to just a different kind of natural disturbance in a complex environment. This allowed Dennis to ask a much broader range of questions about how losing individual trees affects everything else around, right? And this eventually allowed him to develop a system for treating logging as an ecological disturbance, which he began trying to promote in different kinds of venues. Okay, so again, being in a small town meant you had to support other groups' side projects and rely on volunteers in order to get anything done. This meant taking free labor from the odd anthropologist that wants to go out into the forest and help you measure trees periodically. If you want to collect data, it means conscripting these kind of oddball teams rather than paid government employees, because there simply aren't that many paid government employees around, right? So people have different reasons for going out and helping you with your project. And this also means absorbing a wide range of viewpoints, right? So the actual measurement work, which I'm pointing to here, this is pretty monotonous. Like, this literally means measuring several thousand trees every few years, correlating your measurements to a variety of growth factors depending on where the trees are, and then plugging them all into a database, which you feed into a model and progressively refine to see if it accurately predicts how quickly trees are growing, right? Pretty mundane stuff that I'm sure a lot of students who have taken ecology classes have some degree of familiarity with, right? So a lot of the help that Dennis received for these projects was from people who are engaged in environmental politics at the local level, right? People have very specific questions about what's going on in these areas, and people who are interested in showing the effects of clear cutting on all kinds of different factors, not just on how fast trees grow, but on, say, the compaction of soils and the loss of habitat for different animal species, simplification of moss species, all of these different things, which normally fall well outside the purview of, say, a conventional, centrally driven government silviculture experimental site, right? So all these little questions kind of crawling up around the walls, which ultimately define what this research forest really meant. So we've been talking a lot about fieldwork so far, but how does all of this impact the kind of computer simulation that someone might want to build in these circumstances? Again, something that can be easily shared, something that can draw people in, right? So Dennis helped to develop a model called SORTI-ND that projects conditions at his own research forest, and then began conscripting other developers to help him expand it to answer more kinds of questions. This is a model that's open source, it's very easy to learn, and it's something that he could train visiting students in that they could then go to their home institutions and use to answer research questions of their own, right? This is also something that allowed the articles that he was publishing based on his research there to get his own approach, this gap dynamics approach, established as a credible way to study small-scale harvesting, right? So these are a lot of kind of benchmarks for establishing yourself as an academic that I think resonate with a lot of the people who are in this room, right? Having this model also allowed him to start recruiting other forestry professors and professionals from around North America, including a number of disgruntled government scientists like himself who wanted to promote an alternative system to clear cutting that was dominating so many other forestry districts in which these people worked. Now here's where the story starts to get a lot more complicated, because since Dennis was still a government scientist, he was connected to policymakers, right? Even if he was still working in this tiny little government office, literally 500 miles away. So in the early 2000s, Dennis and his collaborators started saying, if we can model different harvesting patterns that prove to be much healthier in the long term, and particularly all of these other forest values that kind of fall out of the calculations of these other models, why can't we push the government to start adopting this as policy, right? And when the mountain pine beetle exploded literally right after this, Dennis admitted to me that it felt like this was his big chance to show what SORTI-ND could do, right? I mean, it's designed to treat all kinds of disturbances in the same space, and the mountain pine beetle was this kind of disturbance to end all disturbances. It was so massive, and it completely thwarted any attempt of government modelers to do anything with it that didn't involve first going in and simply cutting everything down. So Dennis to the rescue, right? Not quite. When I spent time with computer simulation builders in the British Columbia Forest Service headquarters in Victoria for a few months, it became clear to me pretty quickly that they had other thoughts about the value of this kind of work. I mean, why? Like, why do you think this is? I mean, again, this is not a story of good guys and bad guys, despite the fact that this quote is not super flattering for whoever's authoring it. But it might seem pretty simplistic to remind ourselves of this. But the world looks a little bit differently from the window of a tiny bungalow in a northern logging town, which is where the Bulkley Valley Research Center is based, than it does from the 12th floor of a government building in a major city, right? So Smithers, okay. So the lead developer of the TAS program, I'm going to start talking about now, whom I'm going to call Arnold. He's about the same age as Dennis. He just retired last year, and while Dennis was running his research forest and publishing in a range of ecology journals, Arnold had a dedicated staff of programmers who were slowly tweaking his simulator, TAS here, and interacting on a daily basis with policymakers who use the results of his simulations to plan tree harvests for all of British Columbia. So again, this is a simulator that is based on the idea that you're going to cut everything down and then start again, right? You're not going to treat things as disturbances because you're going to, you want to be able to project these results for large areas, and you want them to be very specific and accurate, right? So this might sound pretty mundane. Again, forestry models, right? But what we're really talking about here is maybe the most influential tree growth model in the world, right? So just to kind of take a step back and appreciate this, where and how quickly British Columbia cuts down trees has a huge impact on carbon emissions and global warming. And it can completely change the global timber market, right? Affecting the prices of paper in Japan and the prices of houses in California, right? And Arnold takes this influence very seriously. I mean, the main way that his group refines tasks is not by finding volunteers to measure trees in a couple random research forests every few years, but by building an enormous archive of standardized measurements that have been taken in forests all over the world. So we're not talking about half a dozen research forests. We're talking about tens of thousands of normalized tree stands, right? So this is the kind of thing that you can do if you have a big government ministry that's backing you, right? If you have budgets in the millions of dollars every single year to progressively refine your model, right? So gathering data sets correlating, say, landscape types. You can classify landscapes according to all of your different growth factors. And feeding them into a model over and over and over and over again. So you can eventually predict optimal growing speeds for incredibly specific conditions. This is what this model is all about, right? This is what Arnold kind of banked his legacy on. This is the kind of show of force, as sociologists of science might describe it, that's used to justify TAS as the model for the whole province. And it's also the show of force that's used to cast doubt on little upstart simulators that haven't been rigorously verified yet, right? So in other words, just like Dennis and the sortie model are inseparable from this kind of loose, jangly network of collaborators, activists, research forests, and academic journals, in which his career really takes its meaning, Arnold and TAS are inseparable from this huge database and from the responsibility to inform economic planning for all of British Columbia. Okay, so one more time. How does this become an anthropological story? Both Dennis and Arnold, these eminent researchers, they're known throughout the modeling world. They're facing the ends of their careers in very different ways. For Dennis, being able to live in a small town like Smithers and support these different small networks for decades has meant cobbling together different kinds of projects, right? And garnering support from different kinds of groups who might be here one day, gone the next. And it's also one of the reasons that he's been wary of trying to attach himself too directly to any particular government program, even if it cost him the chance to see sortie taken up as this really big policy-making instrument, right? Even if it cost him kind of influence in the most obvious sense of the term. And I mean, really, dealing with the precariousness of doing research in a small town means knowing that your grand ambitions are probably not going to play out unless you can get people to adopt your work to their own needs, right? It means really kind of taking stock of what do you really mean by ambition, right? How do you really define that? How do you define success? And it also means allowing people to bring new questions, especially climate change related questions, to your work, to expand on it in different ways. And this is really what Dennis is is referring to when he says, you know, wistfully but not really regretfully, that there's a lot of old experiments in forests that are well taken care of for 10 or 15 or 25 years, and then they kind of fade away. And he said this to me right when we were standing in front of this experimental forest sign, which was right down the road from his experimental forest, which had been abandoned 10 years earlier, right? Because it was centrally directed by the government in Victoria, and people only came up to visit it every couple of years. And at a certain point, people just stopped coming, right? So to put it bluntly, Dennis, as a scientist, and as a computer modeler in particular, he's facing generational succession, very kind of big anthropological concept. He's facing succession essentially by promoting the recontextualization of his legacy. He's essentially promoting his legacy by letting go. Since he knows that the questions and the technology that are driving people to study forests are changing, and that the institutional forms of support are going to be constantly changing too. The pressures that are facing Arnold and the task group are actually pretty similar. There's been less and less support for environmental research in general, provided by federal and provincial governments over the years. He's seeing the constant downsizing of his staff. When it was at its height in the late 90s, he had 15 programmers directly working under him every day. Now he has 2. And he was increasingly having to contract out different aspects of model development. The meaning of that model is going to be very different from someone who's fulfilling a 2-week contract than someone who's building their entire career based on what this model means to British Columbia, right? So at the same time, this rigid hierarchy, the closed source code that had once made his model so hugely influential and had made Arnold himself so indispensable to the government, essentially the most powerful computer programmer in the province, had effectively frozen his model at the worst possible time, right after the mountain pine beetle came through and set everything back to who knows what, right? So again, it's really tempting to think about computer simulations as these timeless, placeless abstractions that operate on their own. But if you ask aging programmers who work for government agencies and are facing these kinds of downsizing, which again, US Geological Survey, US Forest Service, all of these different major resource management institutions in North America have been downsizing for decades. So this is something that's very palpable for them, right? It's almost as if the more successful their work becomes, the more invisible they become, right? Because the model speaks for itself, right? So over the past 15 years, this has happened in a big way for task developers, particularly regarding their connections to this massive database that they look to for the accuracy of their model, not to mention their status and their legitimacy as major government scientists, right? Most of this data comes from BC at thousands of sites that were remeasured in person every single decade, right? But as remote sensing and automated image analysis have taken off, the provincial government essentially decided that it would be a lot cheaper to use satellite photos to replace all of these teams of field workers. Again, this is another big point. Why do people produce simulations? Well, sometimes they're just cheaper than going out with a tape measure 2,000 miles north to measure a tree, right? And just to be clear, I mean, you can do all kinds of amazing, fantastic things with remote sensing, and the response to the pine beetle would have been completely different if they didn't have eyes in the sky and automated models to start helping them analyze different kinds of questions, right? So this is not a kind of knock against remote sensing. I wouldn't do that in an environmental studies program. But these are mostly useful for larger scale processes, I think you'll agree, and not for kind of assessing tiny increments of growth on individual trees, right? So in other words, just to be clear about what I'm talking about, instead of updating its original database with physical measurements year after year, TAS itself is now simulating the very data that programmers use to refine it, right? Which creates this kind of tautological feedback loop. And this paradox is not lost on Arnold's colleagues, right? Who kept on coming back to this notion of garbage in, garbage out that computer programmers use to sometimes cynically discuss the perversions of their work. But because of how his group is positioned within the government, and the fact that they've looked down on academics and ecologists like Dennis in the past, it means that they don't have this diverse base of support to help them challenge these kinds of realities, right? And they also know that climate change is going to drive changes that their model won't be able to predict, but they'll likely all be retired or let go before the main impacts of this hit and the government has to respond, right? So there's a lot of gallows humor in these kinds of institutions, which I'm sure a lot of the senior environmental scientists in this room can attest, right? And all this brings me back to my original thought exercise. How do different kinds of forestry modelers experience time in the forest? For Arnold and other central members of government planning circles, they can see the future in incredibly fine detail, partly because they've been responsible for decades for creating it, right? By directing logging companies to cut and replant in particular kinds of ways, right? These are the performative modelers. But they also know that they have tremendous blind spots. And because of the narrow, dependent relationship that they've cultivated with the government, they essentially have to sit by and hope that a lot of these catastrophic changes don't happen. And this is a pretty frustrating and deflating way to end what's otherwise been a pretty celebrated set of careers. So I think you can imagine. For Dennis and the ramshackle, occasionally overlapping Date Creek Research Forest affiliates and Sortie ND developer network, whom I spent time with in Smithers, they can describe the general outlines of a far broader range of changes. I mean, they can see future tree disease susceptibilities creeping in, and they can see the small living trees making their way amongst wide swaths of dead pine because they're conceptualizing the forest in a different way to begin with, partly because of the political commitments that they took into the process before they even started setting up their simulations, right? But like the task group, there isn't a whole lot that they can actually do to affect these changes before they happen, right? Although they can gain a small sense of agency by setting up new collaborations and helping other programmers adopt Sortie to address new kinds of ecological questions, right? So just to wrap up, I think it's important to keep these kinds of relationships in mind as governments downsize research divisions and base more and more environmental planning decisions on remote sensing technologies and on the work of temporary employees. Right? Our dependency on computer simulations is only going to grow more intense in the coming decades, and recognizing exactly where these models come from and how they reflect the social and professional pressures that are faced by the programmers who are making them, not allowing the models to quote unquote speak for themselves, will go a long way towards closing the gap between how different social groups and institutions are imagining the future and what kinds of futures these imaginings are actually helping to produce. So, thank you.
Anybody?
So I wanted to ask a little bit about specifically the phenomenon of environmental governmental agencies shrinking so much apparently throughout North America. I know I witnessed this with some of the institutions that I'm collaborating with. Is it just economic, or are there issues of just politically, just in general, North American countries are turning against their environmental scientists, or what is your thought on sort of?
I think there's a number of different rationales. The kind of official reasons that are being given are often quite at odds with the rationales that are being expressed by the people who are being most affected by these changes. So the kind of official line in British Columbia is never that we care less about the environment, right? They're always going to, there's always this sort of like, if anything, they're going to be increasing their control more and more and more. But a lot of the things that are driving this are policy changes at a kind of broad scale that you could kind of group under the whole like neoliberalization umbrella, where a lot of this analytical work is not being done in advance to kind of prescribe certain kinds of changes, but is now being asked of corporate developers as a way of kind of doing their own work, right? And saying, well, rather than hiring people to do all this stuff in advance, we'll just periodically audit corporate developers and logging companies to make sure that they're abiding by these standards. And a lot of the auditing standards are kind of impossible to actually follow out, which has caused a lot more consternation. But I think there's also this sense, especially in Canada, because a lot of Canadians are reflecting, okay, how are we different from the US? I mean, as people may or may not be aware, Canadians think about the United States a lot more often than the United States thinks about Canada. And what I had a lot of people up there telling me was, it was almost like they reflect the changes that happen in the United States about 20 years later. right? So the kind of privatization of research, the moving of research to governments, like the kind of closing of big research divisions in even in corporations, right? This is something that happened in the United States largely in the late 70s and 1980s as accountants kind of went into large corporations, went into the kind of the Intels and the kind of large oil companies of the world and said, who's losing you the most money? Oh, it's your research division, right? So this is when these groups started losing their research divisions. But in Canada, this process didn't start until the early 2000s. And it's largely because kind of shifts in conservative governments, the sort of, the kind of rah-rah, like budget cutting stuff. And at least if you trust the kind of people in charge, they'll say, well, we need to balance with our entitlement spending, right? Which has been on the rise in Canada. And this is not something that people talk about quite as much in the US as, okay, we have all this entitlement spending which needs to be kind of bracketed against scientific research, but at the scales at which people have conversations about budgets in Canada, that's usually what people are talking about. So, more questions?
So I have a question. I actually have two questions, but this first one is sort of feeling like these models became so obsolete as soon as the mountain pine beetle came through and wiped everything out. And so, you know, as a modeler, we want to feel like our models are relevant, and then all of a sudden they're completely irrelevant. And so then in a, how have these scientists tried to stay relevant in a chaotic world? And so in some sense, if I were running the government of BC, it's like, what have you given me lately?
Yep.
You know, show me something that I can actually work with. What were some of the ways that they were trying to sort of deal with this crisis in a way that would help them convince the funders to keep them going? And then the second question is just, I was expecting that there would be an indigenous Native American component here to the dynamics of forestry. Is that really only a fisheries issue?
No,
and so I was kind of curious to what degree the lands are just controlled by government agencies, or what is the role of indigenous Native Americans?
That's a great question. The Date Creek Research Forest, from which this is taken, rests on the Ksagailaha house group territory of the Gitxsan First Nation, with whom I also did a fair amount of research. The scale of questions that you're asking, quite frankly, for them would have been super relevant and super on point back in the late 1990s when they actually had enough funding to support these projects. But I mean, if cutbacks have hurt these kind of major government actors in a big way, they've completely decimated any kind of ab initio First Nations forestry research programs, which were only just starting to get onto their feet in the 1990s before these budget cuts came through and kind of scattered people to the wind. They do produce their own models in some way, but one of the things that I address in the other parts of my research is that the people who are doing this kind of work, who kind of have to navigate institutional identities in very different ways if they come from a First Nation group that has an unceded land claim, like the Gitxsan, is that nowadays, in order to get any kind of work funded, they have to be a sort of they have to align themselves either solely with a government institution or solely with a corporate developer, right? So it's kind of, I'm independent consultant first and Gitxsan second, and therefore a lot of the more kind of overt political claims aren't allowed to come to the surface in the way that they were in the 1990s. So as far as the first question, you know, you get really, really, really cynical responses to that if you ask the kind of major government modelers, is like, what is being done? They feel like they're essentially being forced to lie. They're being forced to kind of take the ambiguity and the uncertainty that is going to be in any kind of model and solely talk about the most positive possible outcomes in the reports that they make public. Otherwise, they'll be fired. And a lot of them have decided to simply retire rather than kind of face this indignity or to move into the private sector. So there really is a kind of sense of hopelessness as far as how they can move this forward, because there's the sense that the government doesn't actually want them to do anything. They want them to kind of use models to back up the policy decisions that have already been made, rather than generating new kinds of policy directions based on these modeling outcomes. And I think that this is reflective of a really, really massive ideological divide between like currently existing, like the research division within the British Columbia Forest Service as it currently is and the current government. It hasn't always been this bad. But there's always a little bit of the, we're the researchers, we're the government, and this kind of boundary setting that people tend to do in these situations. But I think the kind of disconnect as far as how much this research is being taken seriously is probably about as big as it's ever been. Not a happy answer. We have a couple questions over there. Yep. 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 Yeah. That's an excellent question. The social organization of different kinds of modeling technologies. I mean, I kind of as far as I got with describing tasks was to say that it's closed source. It's very monolithic, right? It's very centrally directed, and it's closed source partly to keep out critiques from environmentalist groups, right? So there was the sense that if people had access to the guts of these models in the early 1990s when folks were chaining themselves to tractors and barricading logging roads, that they would try to come up with kind of numerical critiques of British Columbia timber planning policy. And that's one of the reasons that they've kept it so tightly controlled. So the customer there is, the customer is really the timber developers who want to get their allocations and want to be able to say that, well, the British Columbia government rubber stamped it, so we're in the clear, right? As far as these agile groups, they're actually one more thing. And it's as far as the modeling that's going on within the British Columbia government, there's even older models. There's lots of numerical, I mean, this is a spatial model, but there are lots of numerical models that are being and developed in the 1940s, 1950s that were developed to measure similar things that are also kind of occurring along the periphery too. So it's never just that one model comes in and completely replaces everyone. It's just that they kind of have to jockey for position as far as different aspects of the timber planning policy process plays out. It's mundane in kind of the messiest way possible. And the more agile teams, they're able to answer questions more quickly, they're able to be a lot more targeted, but they're also, frankly, a lot easier to marginalize because these big groups can say, well, this model isn't verified, you don't have 10,000 data sets backing you up, and you need to go through all of this other very expensive process in order for us to take your numbers seriously, right? We need to see that 18th decimal point before we're going to give you a cubicle here, right? So in a sense, they've been kind of restricted to maybe more academic and activist roles. And the people who are trying to promote these kinds of models within government have essentially seen themselves derided as being activists, right? So I think it's entirely possible that the models that eventually replace tasks will have much more in common with what you're describing, but they'll ultimately be controlled by a few very powerful people that want to kind of like make sure a certain chain of decision making, a certain chain of command within these institutions stays intact.
We should probably stop there, but I just wanted to make 2 points. You're here for a bit. I know you're about to defend your dissertation in 4 weeks, so let's give him a big hurrah on that. Thank you again, and if any of you are interested in modeling, I'm sure you could probably grab him during his office hours and sort of think about that as a career. I know some of you are thinking about modeling in your own career, so I'm sure Tom would be happy to meet with you and talk to you either now for a few minutes or at another time.
Yeah, and please email me as well. I'm happy to talk more. Thanks again.